Greetings and salutations, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Gaming Materialists. My name is Djene and Bajalan, and I am your host for the evening. We are recording this in the past, so this is not live. So, guys, if you're in the chat wondering if we're live, we're not actually live. But of course, as always, I am joined on Gaming Materialist by my co-host and my comrade, as Jason calls him, the Black Sean King. He is C. Derek Varn. Welcome, Varn.
Hello. How are you?
I'm doing good. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. We're talking about one of my favorite subjects today, so we have that, and it's nice and springy here in Utah. Which is actually relevant to today's discussion, believe it or not. But yeah,
it is nice and sunny here in Kingston upon Hull. I've been enjoying the
rare, isn't it?
It is very rare. The weather's been quite nice recently, but we got a sunny day, so we had a barbecue outside, or what you guys call grilling meat, which we call a barbecue. And my brother,
we call it a barbecue too, depending on where in the United States you are.
That's true. I get confused. We call the thing that you cook on a barbecue, whereas I think you call it grilling in America. I get confused.
Yeah, it's a Midwestern thing. The thing is, yeah. You're in Indiana, so no, you're in Missouri. Yeah, so I mean, it's a grill. You may hear barbecuing referred to as barbecuing or grilling. But we refer to it in the South as barbecuing, but that also includes smoking meat. So that's, so it's a little bit more expansive. I don't recognize barbecue in other parts of the country, so I don't even know what you're talking about in England.
Fair enough. Well, we burnt some meat.
What's it? Okay. I was like, were you burning blood pudding? Isn't that what you guys do?
No, we don't burn black pudding. I did buy some black pudding, but people have not come here to listen to us talk about meat. Although maybe we should do a meat show, Varn. We're actually talking about, as Varn said, one of his favorite topics, which is Dungeons and Dragons, and more specifically, the recent announcement that two of the Dungeons and Dragons settings that were popular in the 1980s and 1990s, Spelljammer and Dragonlance, are going to be revived for the new edition of Dungeons and Dragons. And this follows kind of a pattern for Wizards of the Coast, who have been, let's just say, coasting off nostalgia and re-releasing and revamping some of their popular settings from the golden age of TSR, before Wizards of the Coast purchased the Dungeons and Dragons IP in the late 1990s. So Spelljammer and Dragonlance are interesting in that they are very popular settings, and they're very much settings that changed or defined the trajectory of roleplay and even of fantasy literature to a certain degree, I would say. So Varn knows a lot more about this than I. So I'm going to start perhaps, and he can outline these settings. And perhaps we'll begin with, let's say, the more conventional setting, which is Dragonlance. Varn, what is Dragonlance? What's its origins? And why is it significant in the history of Dungeons and Dragons?
Well, Dragonlance came out in 1984, and it shifted the mode of D&D gameplay from the Gygax style campaigns, which are usually a home-based city where you run into dungeons and run back, that are constantly running, and you're actually competing against other dungeon groups, and it was largely designed for tournament play. If you've ever played those D&D games, they're often funhouse style. There's no continuity, they don't try to make the dungeons make any ecological sense or anything like that. That wasn't the point. Dragonlance changed all that, in that it was a world that had worked out ecologies, worked out specific schools of magic, different kinds of dwarves, And it also began the D&D tradition of spin-off novels, which is something that's like been running through a lot of big RPs. I mean, you see it in the old White Wolf RPs too. But this really happens and shifts the game from the way that we know the old, basic and advanced D&D of the early 80s to the more high fantasy, Tolkien-inspired world of the late 80s. First it was conceived by Laura and Tracy Hickman. And then a novel series was really expanded on and kind of fleshed it out with key characters. And Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss's novels, which I read as a kid, they vary in quality greatly. Some of them are interesting, some of them aren't.
And for those who are interested, there is actually a very bad animated version of them as well. I want to say there's a very poor animated adaptation of Dragonlance. I don't know if you've seen that, Varn.
Yeah, it's bad. I tried to watch it. It's not very good.
But I think to provide a little bit of context to then, Dragonlance marks this shift from the more Conan the Barbarian style world, from the style of play in which is what people might call a Westmoreland, a West Marches game these days, which is kind of an open table, which is designed for large numbers of players and is very much more on the war games and puzzle solving side of things to, I think, and this is very important, to a more story driven type of RPG and even a more railroady type of RPG in which people are playing as heroes in a story rather than adventurers doing a quasi war game down a junction. We've talked about this before on Gaming Materialists. By the 1990s, this storyteller mode was very popular, especially with the rise of White Wolf games, where in fact, their Dungeon Master in White Wolf games was the storyteller. But that type of role play, although it's probably existed before Dragonlance, very much is codified to a certain degree through the popularity of Dragonlance and the spin-off world that was created from that.
Right. I mean, and you see this increasingly in the editions of the Wizards of the Coast editions of the property. And part of the issue is there's IP issues with Dragonlance that get complicated, and we'll come back to that later. But TSR's Dragonlance really kind of set up the next thing that became default D&D for many people, which is Forgotten Realms, which is Ed Greenwood and that world. Now, current D&D 5th Ed is interesting in that in 3 and 3.5, the default world is Greyhawk, but no one really knew much about Greyhawk because, frankly, it's set up for these West Marches style games. And so quickly in the first Wizards editions of D&D, Forgotten Realms became the default, particularly with video games, because it had more developed characters and lore than Greyhawk did. Greyhawk had some things that mostly actually came in from the cartoon. Now, in 5th edition D&D, even though they will make references to these other worlds, up to this point, we've only gotten Eberron, which is actually, even though it's 20 years old now, a relatively new D&D world. And then like one part of the Forgotten Realms. And then if you go into the campaign settings, which is really what D&D has been driving, most of their supplements are campaign settings or world books, or they are adventures with additional rules now, which is a shift from prior splat books and stuff like that they did. If you look at these, they're set up in a hybrid world actually of Forgotten Realms and Greyhawk. All right. If you get like some of the adventure collections that they've done that are remakes of classic D&D, you'll have Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms adventures put by each other. And for purists, this frustrates them because they don't technically have the same lore. But one of the things that happened with Dragonlance is very strongly attached to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. When 3.5 did the open license, there was a deal made where Sovereign Games and not Wizards of the Coast actually made and released the Dragonlance material. All right. Now, in some ways, that's similar to what we have with Critical Role. Okay, because there was a Critical Role book released this year as well, another book. But Critical Role itself, in its own press, released a Tal'Dorei world book. And for those of you who don't know, there's 2 major continents, and then there's this ocean thing on Critical Role. And Critical Role basically now is split between Wizards of the Coast official stuff and stuff released by Darlington Press, which is Critical Role's own press, to flesh it out. Well, what's interesting about Dragonlance is priorly Hickman and Weiss have had a lot of control over it. There have been lawsuits recently around this. They've been settled. Particularly something about novels not being released, and the novels are released in conjunction with Wizards of the Coast. The Sovereign Press deal was interesting because for whatever reason, and I actually haven't found the reasons for this, Wizards licensed the production of Dragonlance back to Hickman in the 3.5 era, but they owned it. It was part of the acquisition of TSR. They have not brought it back. They have not brought back an official, release by the owners of D&D product since Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. The Dragonlance 3.5 world, because it wasn't an official product. And there was such a competition of open license products, did not do that well. Like, I had the book at one point, but I don't remember many people playing Dragonlance. People were still reading the novels, but it largely kind of faded away.
And I think just to put a point in this kind of legal dispute reflects the evolution of the gaming industry in general, from an industry that was basically just a bunch of dudes and creators making things towards a more corporate style of doing business. And of course, especially in the 80s and 90s, this led to a lot of confusion about who owned what and whose IP rights, who possessed the IP rights. This was seen with Games Workshop. There were certain concepts in Games Workshop which were not owned by Games Workshop and have been subsequently pushed out of Games Workshop law because of the sort of legal issues surrounding it. And that's true again with Dragonlance, with the kind of disputed rights over Dragonlance, over different types of media, from novels to role play games and things like that. And obviously we see in general, if you notice, and I don't know if you notice, Varn, but probably you do. If you look at the books in the 70s and 80s and 90s, you knew who wrote those books very clearly. Mm-hmm. A lot more of these role play books now are either the people who write them are kind of not as prominently featured or not featured at all, because this is very much nowadays there's much more of a drive towards having this as a corporate product to develop the brand rather than an individual, like the creation of an individual author, building a role play game or a rule set, right. Things like that.
Yeah, you even see this with worlds with clear origin. So like Forgotten Realms has been in every edition of D&D since second ed event. Well, actually since first ed advance, I believe it came out in 87. Ed Greenwood is super attached to it, but not anymore. So, and I say that because even through fourth edition, Ed Greenwood's name is strongly attached to Forgotten Realms. Now he still consults, I think, with Wizards on a lot of this stuff. You'll see his name in books, but you don't see it associated with a particular creator. The exception to that is an interesting exception, and that is Eberron. Eberron is still strongly associated with Keith Baker, but you will notice that his name on the Wizards official book is not huge. His name on supplementary products in which they license for that book, which is mostly done through the DMs Guild, is like it's Keith Baker games. But in general, they've tamped down on that. You don't know who the writers are. The other thing that I think this is a response to that's interesting. So one of the controversies around Dragonlance is it is where you really get the alignment as associated with race, but race as in species, because it's not a like. And that was one of the first places, I believe in. It was recently. I don't know when the criticism really began. Of alignment being attached to a certain race that is carried through in Forgotten Realms too. So orcs are evil and drow are evil, except when they're not even in the books. Historically, so this has been heavily criticized. This is one of the interesting things about this, that bringing it back right now, because one thing that happened this year is they re-released their expansion books. So they revised Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Gotta look at it because I have it literally back there. Mordecai's Monsters, which became Mordecai's Monsters of the Mostiverse, and what's it? Sandor's Guide to Everything or whatever, which are expansion books, like more fleshed out rules. One of the controversial things they did was in the revision of the monster book, which has also been released as a solo book, because it's a big enough revision that they renamed the book. Is to remove any alignment attached to a monster species. So while that it doesn't mean, orcs are not inherently evil. Gnolls are not inherently chaotic evil. They are portrayed as most likely to be that for whatever gods and stuff they worship, but it's not that. Now this has been the biggest controversy in D&D verse in a while. All right, and so bringing Dragonlance back is interesting. Because Dragonlance is considered the origins of that. Yes, there was alignment in D&D, but people who don't know, if you go up 70s D&D, there's only 2 alignments. It's order and chaos. And they don't really strongly relate to good and evil. Gygax was pressured towards the middle of the 70s, and I think he was pressured from his own religious background. So Gygax was Christian. I don't remember what flavor of Protestant he was, which always again made the Satanic Hispanic thing hilarious to me, because I'm like, hey, that's one of the few books by a Christian creator anyway. But and there's some religious stuff with Dragonlance too, and we'll get into that in a minute. What you'll see with that is that they seem to be signaling that yes, we are removing this racial alignment stuff, but we're not getting rid of these old worlds. In fact, we're going to bring back the world that kind of began all this period, which I think is an interesting signaling after the controversy at the beginning of the year. But
the alignment thing is interesting because the whole question of alignment and race, which was so fundamental to D&D, even though I think it's a little bit silly to map it onto, like racial politics or essentialism, because after all, this is a game, and these things.
And things aren't humans either. Like they're humanoids.
But it does reflect an interesting shift in the culture, an interesting rejection of essentialism to a certain degree, filtering into concepts of species and race and alignment in Dungeons and Dragons, which is interesting again because, of course, Dragonlance is very derivative of the Tolkien world, which, of course, Tolkien is extremely, it is Tolkien's writing is this kind of epic of good and evil, in which good and evil aren't defined by actions, but by the essence of whether they're good or evil, right?
Right.
Sauron is the bad guy because Sauron is the bad guy, and he's evil, and it's self-evident that he's evil, and orcs are evil. So obviously, I think people often forget, especially if you play D&D in the 90s, which I think is most of the, a lot of people, that, early D&D was a lot more heterodox in its sort of worldview. I mean, you had aliens, you had barbarians, and you had the influence of the pulp genres.
Yeah, I was about to say this is also in a time period before the 60s and 70s, before science fiction and sci-fi have a hard split in marketing. Right. Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit about this on our first thing in D&D, but yet there's tons of that. And like some of the first adventure modules involve like far future stuff. And in fact, imply that Greyhawk is not in the past, but it's actually like a fallen world in the deep future.
It's just like what's his name? Thundercats. Thundercats is in the far future.
Right. And if you go through Appendix N literature, you will see there's a distinct, like, the Tolkien-esque feel of D&D does largely come from Dragonlance. What I think is the religious part of this is interesting. All right. This is something that I've noticed because I live in Utah and I'm not a Mormon. Have never been a Mormon, have, to my knowledge, no Mormon family. But Mormons have a long tradition of being heavily involved in fantasy writing. I have no idea why. Like, I have a friend who speculates why, and he's an ex-Mo and says some salacious things about the Book of Mormon being practiced for sci-fi. But you actually go through and you'll see like a lot of these D&D writers, they come out of Utah, and that's true for Hickman as well. Hickman's still a member of the LDS Church. He went to Brigham Young University. So there's a lot of speculation that there's like that Tolkien-esque fantasy, which comes out of a British and Catholic world. Although Tolkien would like get really mad if you accused him of like, doing the C.S. Lewis thing and writing Christian allegories in his worldview for his books. That was adopted and put in this American context in Utah. So there's been a lot of speculation about like how Mormonism plays a role on Dragonlance. And so it's interesting specifically for that world being the world they pick back up. Now, part of the reason why is clear, it's just marketing. Hickman and Weiss have new Dragonlance novels coming out for the first time in a while. That's going to come out towards the end of the year. That was part of what the lawsuits were about. Something about them not like Wizards of the Coast not allowing them to publish novels that they had agreed to publish, and speculation, and no one knows this because it was all settled out of court, is that basically they had, the new people over at Hasbro did not really know how to deal with the copyright stuff there, and it just had to be hashed out. But what is interesting, and this has come out, supposedly, neither the Hickmans nor Margaret Weiss knew that Dragonlance was being relaunched this year. There was a lot of speculation. There are still a few of the classic AD&D settings that came out in the mid to late 80s that have not been re-released. Dark Sun, which was re-released in 4th edition, has not been re-released. Planescapes has never been re-released. And I think that struck everybody as somewhat strange, given how popular and genre, because Planescapes was just as genre redefining as Dragonlance was. But we'll come back to that. So that's where we're at. Now, this needs to also be noted in another business deal. Last year, the focus seemed to be on releasing Wizards products. So Strixhaven, which is a kind of minor Magic the Gathering card game that is a magic school that is sort of like Harry Potter where you can get killed, was released, and while it sold well because people will buy whatever swill Wizards puts out right now, it was panned by both players and critics as being a highly unuseful book. Wizards is highly adaptable, and Hasbro is now betting its brand on D&D. So
one has to note that people coming out of the Wizards of the Coast corporate structure as well are increasingly assuming leadership roles in Hasbro as a corporation.
Exactly what it meant. Like the new board members are coming out of Wizards, not out of other parts of the toy making industry. So Hasbro sees its future here.
Because this is a very good product for them. It's something that is very flexible, very cheap to produce, and very, very popular, and has gone mainstream in a way that other products have not gone mainstream. I think it would be safe to say, I mean, Dungeons and Dragons, I think, at least in the Western world today, if you talk to somebody under 50 and you say Dungeons and Dragons, they at least vaguely know what you're talking about.
Right. And I would say one of the things that I'm noticing is this is a very popular role-playing game amongst people who were not traditionally associated with role-play. We talked about that. I mean, and that was like true of White Wolf at one time too, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the interesting things about Dragonlance, and this is also interesting, is that it's always been a co-male female creation. So in many ways, this was one of the first attempts to get women on board with role-playing. Didn't really work in the 80s. But you will notice that there are more female heroes in this stuff. It is less war game driven. There's more focus on like romance is more of a part of this world, particularly in the novels, etc.
I mean, that's what I think about when I think about Dragonlance. I think about very railroady modules, right?
Oh, they were extreme. The 80s modules are like extremely railroady.
So it really drives people to play an epic story. Obviously, you know, there is some choice there, but it really drives the dungeon master to push the players in the section. And of course, players would play not their own characters, but they'd be encouraged to play the pre-made characters as well. So this was a different type of role play game. This was something that is heading towards what takes off in the 1990s with the storyteller genre. And you know, we get this. You know, it's an interesting dialectic, right? You have the war games and you have the storyteller desire, and you know, today we have something that is somewhere between that, and it evolves out of this kind of creative tension between people who want to tell a story and people who want to play like a war game. Because you know, if you want to play a war game, you can play a war game. Dungeons and Dragons is not a war game exactly.
So one of the things I think
Hero Quest. You could play something like Hero Quest or Warhammer Quest, which is not really a role play game, but it is going down a dungeon and murdering orcs.
Well, one of the things about this that's interesting is they're also releasing a war game for this. They're releasing a war board game with the book. You don't have to buy them together. They're going to have a world book and then a board game product that comes out with Dragonlance, which is also interesting to me. That tells you how much the storytelling genre has changed, because the fact that we're releasing a war game based off the thing that kind of killed wargaming as the driving model for RPGs. So it's that part of it I find both funny and maybe a little bit historically ironic. But it also tells you how far we've gone down this path, because one of the things that people get frustrated by Wizards now, if they limit themselves to official releases, is if you get a world book, if you got a world book in 3 or 3.5, you got a complete world, right?
You got a box set. And you got a box set back in the day. You used to get a box set with the big fold-out map and a bunch of short soft-cover books, which were more practical for the GM to have a soft-cover book.
Yeah, there were 3 soft-cover books usually. 1 or 2 major maps, all kinds of stuff. I actually love the boxes and
that's something if I was bringing something back for role play games, it would be the box sets because
we were wondering about that when they announced this release, because they were talking about releasing a non-book product that they haven't done before, and we were like, are they bringing back the box sets? Because the box sets have been brought back in the OSR world.
Yeah,
I mean,
there's the new box set coming out for Mothership, for example.
Mm-hmm.
There's and they did bring out sort of box sets with the special editions of the Curse of Strahd and like Ravenloft, but we haven't. I mean, I guess
Spelljammer's coming out as a box set, but it's not a box set like we're talking about. It's coming back. It's coming out as a 3-book set with 3 miniature hardcovers.
But... Well, let's pivot to that. So we've talked a lot about Dragonlance. Dragonlance is coming back. It's definitely going to be popular, I think, no doubt about it. There's going to be the nostalgia around it. I think people will be interested. I think it's probably for people who like to play in pre-made worlds and don't like to homebrew their worlds. It's a more interesting place than Forgotten Realms, which honestly I think is a terrible setting that makes no sense. But let's flip to Spelljammer. So Spelljammer is another one of these settings that is coming out, and I would say is quite on the other end of the scale when it comes to tone from Dragonlance. So if you think of Dragonlance as your Tolkien-esque, derivative Tolkien-esque fantasy, Varn, what the hell is Spelljammer?
So Spelljammer is steampunk space adventures in the multiverse. And I got a hint that Spelljammer was coming by another product they were releasing this year. They're releasing 5 products this year, which is a little unusual for Wizards. Although we're still not anywhere near like the 3.5. We release a product a week.
And probably the strategy that they're pursuing at the moment is a better strategy. Because, I think companies that overload people with new products, although people think they want new products all the time, it's probably best to eke them out a little bit because it leads to fatigue. So, Wizards of the Coast has been very astute with dealing with the market this time around.
Right. So they're releasing this book before Spelljammer. It's coming out very soon, actually, called... let me find it. Journeys through the Radiant Citadel, which is about the ethereal plane, which led me, before they announced Spelljammer, to think maybe they were bringing back Planescape. I still think they might be bringing back Planescape because Spelljammer and Planescape are tied together. But Spelljammer, you basically ride steampunk ships on Philogen through steampunk space to different worlds. So Spelljammer was the first idea that TIR had to connect all these really different campaign settings that have different gods and this, that, and the other to each other. So you could take a set of heroes from a Forgotten Realms world into Al-Kahimba, which is a world they're not bringing back, our Dark Sun world, or something like that. This Spelljammer is steampunk sword and sorcery on weird Philogen ships in outer space, where you can go to any other world in any campaign setting can thus be included in this world system.
And it really sort of it sets up the notion of the multiverse in D&D, which obviously we still have today in D&D. It also creates like a system for what outer space is like. So we have crystal spheres connected by tubes or like magical paths, and you have ships where gravity works in a weird way, and you have bubbles of air. But it was a very detailed and intricate system created for spaceships that look like ships.
Yeah, so it's not like in early D&D where you have full-blown like alien ships in the middle of an island somewhere. But it's fantasy based. But it is fantasy sci-fi, or it's like fantasy, steampunk, Star Wars. I mean, like, it's really hard to explain.
It's very anime. It's very anime in its sensibilities to a certain degree. It's you could, if you envisage, I guess, a fantasy version of Battleship Yamato with with like spaceships that look like ships and pirates and ports and all that kind of things. It's a very imaginative. I would say it's a very imaginative setting, and
right.
It was an interesting solution for them to have for people to move from one campaign setting to another campaign setting. We create this interstellar civilization that connects all the D&D worlds together, because of course we think of everything today in modern D&D as being collected by the planes. Hence, I think we can discuss Planescape in a little bit as one of the ones that may come back next. But Spelljammer is a methodology to create this world so that your party can play in one campaign setting, and then you can buy another campaign setting book and you can go play in that campaign setting with your same heroes. Because, of course, one of the things we learn about Dungeons and Dragons is people get very attached to their heroes.
Right.
It's not like early D&D where you have 10 heroes rolled up. People are coming to the table with a novel of their hero's background and are very committed to keeping their heroes.
Which I think is also something that really comes out of Dragonlance, to be honest, because before that you knew better than to get attached to a character. But it does. You have 3 decades of a different kind of role play where you are expected to embody, and it's more like impromptu acting with a character that you design, as opposed to war games. Are a different kind of war gaming, like a puzzle-based war game. Spelljammer is interesting. Originally, when Jeff Grubb designed it in '89, it didn't include all the D&D worlds because some of them, Mystara and Ravenloft, were in other planes, and this doesn't deal with planar travel, but it does acknowledge that it exists, and it also it enabled people to go from Greyhawk to Forgotten Realms to Dragonlance. Now, in our conception, it's like, okay, that's cool, but like those worlds aren't that different. One of the things that I was saying about one of the things that surprised me about them bringing back Dragonlance is that Dragonlance and Forgotten Realms are Dragonlance. I've always thought of as like a coherent Forgotten Realms style world.
Yeah, it's like fantasy Western Europe. It's fantasy Western Europe, and we've got ourselves another fantasy Western Europe.
Right, and Greyhawk is fantasy Western Europe sometimes, although sometimes it's Polynesian islands, although sometimes it's the future. But
Ravenloft is Gothic, right?
Gothic, Dark Sun. You get later, you get Mystara, which is
it's more Roman. I want to say
ancient. It's Roman. And Dark Sun is when they're like, okay, we took the sword and sorcery out. Now we're going to give you the most sword and sorceryist, slightly sci-fi, and your character is going to die. Because I remember that because I came into D&D really. The first products I got were not post Dragonlance, but I came after Dragonlance, and I was used to this memo that like most of your characters didn't die, and you played Dark Sun and you died all the time. In fact, it would tell you in the book you need to design 3 characters. Go again. I didn't realize until I started studying the history of D&D that used to be all D&D was like that. That you would make multiple characters and run different characters in the same party different parties because they were going to die, and so what's interesting about this is, you say it's very anime. What I think is interesting is Jeff Grubb clearly went into the Appendix N and read all that 19th century space fantasy stuff like Warlords of Mars, because when you look at the way it deals with fantasy space travel, it's basically based off of 19th century misconceptions of space.
Yeah.
So
definitely. I mean, it is it's very Jules Verne in a way. It's very Jules.
Right. Yeah. It's Jules Verne to Warlord of Mars.
Yeah, exactly. And what I am interested in, I think Dragonlance will do well, I wonder how popular Spelljammer is. Given the fact, I think role players today, I think, are a little bit more willing to try weird and new things. I think role play is very, everybody used to just want to play a human and an elf, but now it's all like the furry people, and everybody. You have parties where they're all tabaxi, half orc, this, that, and the other, and something like Spelljammer is going to be a good setting for that.
Right. It's also got a lot of weird. I mean, even originally had a lot of weird monsters and races in it. Like
it's got my favorite race, the hippo dudes with
the gifts.
The gifts, the hippo dudes. They're my favorite guys.
And we know from a companion release from D&D that they are included. They're also included the Tricane, which are from Dark Sun. Although I think they were also in Spelljammer. They were one of the few Dark Sun elements that was in the original Spelljammer. But it does indicate that. So here's the context for this. I don't know if you know, they've announced that they're going to do a 5.5 revision, which is going back from the 3.5, 4 model to we have a good rule set. Everyone's happy with it. We realize if we piss them off again, like we did with 4, or honestly, like Pathfinder did with 2E, and we can talk a little bit about that too. We might lose our stuff here. We have a sweet deal. So they're throwing all this out. Throwing these classic worlds out. Now, one thing we haven't talked about is their model for dealing with the overproduction is basically outsourcing it. They're really generous, as they were with 3.0 and 3.5 with the open license. There's some speculation that they might be slightly less generous with parts of the rules in this new coming up 5.5, but that's not been settled yet. Because while they release these books that are canon, and if you're competitive, and yes, there is competitive D&D, you are stuck to canon books. If you're a home player, they highly encourage you to flesh out your stuff from the DM's Guild. So this is what I was indicating with these little books. They release these little 120-page world books. That's normally in the old D&D model not going to cover it. Now, this is different. They're not doing this with Spelljammer, which I'm going to comment on. The reason why they do that, I think, is because they know that they can get all these other companies and all these other individuals to the DM's Guild and through Kickstarter to produce material for them. And in fact, as of this month, Paizo is now doing it too. So their major competitor is now releasing stuff in 5e rule sets. And what that means is that they don't really compete with most of the role-playing games. Yes, they compete with like OSR style games.
But it's that's a
different product.
5e, for better or for worse, is becoming a universal language of role-play game. It's becoming the GURPS system. I don't know if people remember, you had the generic
universal role-play
system,
which never really actually took off.
It never took off, but there was a lot of setting books. Even Vampire the Masquerade was released in that rule set famously, but it had rule sets for sci-fi. Now, 5e functions quite well for the type of role play, the kind of heroic role play it's designed for, but it's really becoming this kind of universal basic system that is widely adopted. And this is going to be the question for Wizards of the Coast going forwards. They don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg, which is a rule system which is simple enough for new players to pick up, but has enough crunchiness and complexity for people who are more, serious about their role playing and who are really into rules and things like that. Because at its core, it's a very simple system. So what do they produce if they can't, because if they get rid of the rule set, like you said, as they did with 4th edition, they could lose their top spot. People don't remember this, but for a short time, Paizo, with its rehash of 3rd edition, was outselling Wizards of the Coast with their 4th edition. 5th edition comes along. by a lot. 5th edition comes along, and that has become very popular. So
Critical Role was originally done with Pathfinder.
And what's gonna have to the question that people are gonna have to ask, the question that the executives have to ask themselves, it's like, we want people to rebuy the rule sets, but we don't want to annoy people by changing the rule sets so they stop adopting that game. So the new edition that's coming out will probably just be a new rule book, some slightly different rules, but will be largely compatible with the existing system. And so they're going to have to find other products to bring out, because if you already have a rule book, if you're not the DM, do you really need a new rule book? Maybe people will buy it. Maybe people will buy it. But it seems to me it's a much safer strategy to continue to have software for the role-play hardware that you produce. That seems to be a safer bet than taking a very big risk on a radical change with your system.
So what we've seen happening right now, okay, so we have Spelljammer coming out. Spelljammer is coming out as a book box. I'm going to call it a book box to keep it separate from the old boxes. It's 3 80-page hardcovers, so mid-length hardcovers, which is not something we've seen from Wizards. Wizards has been really standard in keeping things above 100 pages, but below 300 pages. And if people remember the old 3.5 world books, those things got huge. And people do make huge books for 5th edition. I was actually looking at Kobold's Press Midgard World is like this. It's gigantic. And it's more like a 3.5 world book. One of the things that I think they've taken advantage of, though, is while there's tons of product being pushed with this, there does seem to be slightly more quality control than there was in the 3.5 era. I don't see quite as many shitty products, although the Kickstarter world is interesting about that. DM's Guild stuff is approved by Wizards at some level, even though it's not produced by them, although sometimes it is. But they go, okay, look, you can use these rules. It'll flesh this stuff out, but we're not saying they're canon. We're not including them. So if you're a collector, you don't have to buy every single thing that comes out on the DM's Guild through Drive Through All 3 Read. But what is interesting about what we're noticing about this is the last couple of years they've just put out basic books, with the exception of that big Strahd box. But what was in the Strahd box? It was just the book, some cards, a really cool box, DM screen. Nothing was essential to what they're doing with Spelljammer is they're releasing a world book, a monster book, and a player's handbook all at once in a box set. That's it's cheaper than their other box sets. So I know this is at a discount, but I think right now it's going for 70, probably retails for 100 on Amazon. Their two core rules and core rule expansion box sets are $150 retail, and you can get them for $80 on Amazon. So they're producing a box set at a cheaper price that people can get, but it is a box set. So like the old boxes, you get a monsters manual that's separate, you get a world guide that's separate, and you get a player's handbook is separate. So if you're a DM and you don't want and your players aren't collectors, and you don't want them to see everything, you just hand them player's handbook and
exactly.
move on.
I mean, yeah, it's a more functional model, really, because the huge books are not functional. They're not, they're not very functional books for what you need them to do. And of course, the OSR books, the independently produced games that are out there, are often sold to people in a way that is far more friendly to gaming use than because obviously, part of it is they have to stand out in the marketplace, and the other part of it is these are often made by very experienced DMs who are this is what's going to work better for playing.
I mean, most famously, you have the box sets from Old School Essentials, which basically just took basic and advanced rules and streamlined them, and then put them in these nice little neat hardcovers that are in a nice box,
which I have. They're very nice. They're very nice.
And even which I have the rules tomes, which are the big leather ones, but they're not that big. They can put easily in a backpack. This is actually a reversal of a trend that we saw in the aughts. In the aughts, there is this, and it kind of capstones actually in the Vampire 20th edition, which was a 600-page. It's a cool book, but it's a 600-page book. And if you get it print on demand, which is the only way to get it now, I always tell people don't, because it will break. The spine.
I mean, really, from a functionality sense, you want to be producing small, soft cover books that are well bound together, that can be used and shared between people. These big tomes are very cool, and you understand why the companies do it.
I collect them, but I don't play with them.
You don't play with them, exactly. You don't play with them. So we've discussed Spelljammer. We have discussed Dragonlance. Let's talk for the last couple of minutes about what do you think is going to be next on the agenda for Wizards of the Coast. What's the next? What are our predictions for? Is there going to be a new setting, or are they going to bring back an old setting?
What I predict, as long as there's still old settings to go through, and there's some I know they're not going to bring back. Like, we're not going to get Al-Kahim ever again, because it would be
doing a racism.
Yeah, I mean, when I go back and look at it, I don't find it particularly racist for something made in the 80s, but I do think, like, our standards for Orientalism do not make that possible now. Mm-hmm. I also think, and you did see this in Forgotten Realms in 3.5, you will see the diversification of these settings. One thing Paizo has that that Wizard still doesn't have is a fantasy African setting. One thing I don't see them doing is bringing back Oriental Adventures. That's also not going to come back. But I could see a multi-ethnic Asian-based setting that they might want to bring. Or they might just include that stuff in later supplements of the main world like they do in Forgotten Realms now. I mean, the issue with Forgotten Realms, as we've talked about, is it doesn't make sense. It's like a mega continent with like different continental cultures on it. We only focus on the European ones. There are non-European ones there, but
it doesn't conform. It conforms to a 12-year-old's understanding of what medieval politics was like.
Right. I mean, Greenwood tried to fix it in 4th edition and some other places, but it actually caused more problems than helped. One of the things that you have now, and this has been both a benefit and a problem of D&D, with the exception of the Wizards of the Coast worlds, which are all very specific, such as their Ravnica release, their Theros release, which is ancient Greece, and of course, that barely feels like a magic that just now we have an ancient Greek setting, and.
Well, I think the Ravnica one was actually.
I think it's a great setting, believe it or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting because it's a different setting. The big problem with the Dragonlance setting is that it's too similar to Forgotten Realms. And
it's better, but it's very similar. And I was surprised they brought it back.
Ravnica is a different setting. Eberron is a very different setting. You may or may not like these settings or the aesthetic of those settings, but they are a different enough product to justify their existence.
Right. That was the problem with classic AD&D, right? Is Greyhawk, as it was kind of re-understood in the late 80s, particularly after Gygax left, Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance are all very similar. They're all very, very similar. Spelljammer's not. Spelljammer has all kinds of crazy stuff in it.
Exactly. Spelljammer, and if they bring back Planescapes, which is the Plains version of it,
that one's wild.
That's a wild, magical, like very Gates high fantasy. It's really what actually the New Age of Sigmar in the Warhammer franchise is going for. This kind of like planes and different realms and
Monty Cook games, and Monty Cook was one of the designers of Playscapes. He wasn't the designer, that was Seb Cook, and they're not related. That's confusing, I know. But has really taken over the Planescapes field, so much so they're releasing a what is clearly a 5e Planescapes clone called Planebreaker.
And there's also Troika Games have their own RPG, OSR style RPG based on the old Fighting Fantasy system.
Yep, which is also, it's Planescapes derived, but that was deliberately designed. If Planescapes never developed its its world, because Troika OSR games are random roll and they give you very specific weird things, but the way those work is you actually have to develop the world and the backstory to make it make any sense.
Right, exactly. So it's kind of an interesting, it's an interesting take on the Planescapes field. So I think, I think Wizards of the Coast's wisest move would be to try and develop new and different and interesting settings, perhaps based on other worlds, cultures that exist in the world, but doing so in a way that is respectful and to those, which is doable,
right. And they still haven't released the main Magic setting either. Like, that's the other thing, is the main Magic setting, and there is one, has not been turned into a D&D product yet, which I don't know that they'll do, because I think they do want the default worlds to be fairly separate, but they have now done a Forgotten Realms Magic game. So it's like, is the reverse going to happen as Hasbro increasingly sees its, and Wizards increasingly see their future not in the card gaming, but back into RPGs?
And the other question is, what other kind of product lines are they going to start bringing out for these things? Will they get into the miniatures field? That is,
they have gotten into some of them.
Well, they license them. Them. But could they bring them in-house? That is another question for the future. Because if they are not going to radically rewrite the rules, at least in the near future, there's going to be a need to provide new products for the market. Books may fit in some ways. Other tie-in products are perfectly plausible ways to go. And
I think the indication with this Dragonlance board game is that they may be heading that way, because one of the things that's going to mean is they've at least now done board game style miniatures for a game that you already have a world for. So you can, and they said you can import your character from the war game into the setting and vice versa, which that means,
will they bring back Birthright then?
Yeah, that's a question. Will they bring back Birthright? Will they? There's still a lot of IPs. I mean, famously, Planescapes is the one that everyone's been clamoring for. Dark Sun is the other one, because Dark Sun is so different from most of the 80s D&D. I mean, it was my introduction. Like, the first thing I ever got was like the core books, and I told you the story, like at a flea market, I picked up a secondhand, complete though, version of the Dark Sun box, and then I got the Planescapes box at another flea market. So like, those were my introductions to this, and they tried to bring Dark Sun back in 4th edition because it was in such high demand, but it was 4th edition, so people didn't like it. Like, people didn't deal with it. The other thing though that we have to deal with is, it looks like Pazzo is giving up on really trying to force people into 2E, 4E D&D style, and is now going, okay, fine, we're going to start releasing our adventure and world books in both our system. And I'm wondering, we haven't seen this right now, it's just adventures, but I'm wondering if they're going to start releasing Galarian books in 5E, because that is a really nice developed world, and while it is kind of European, it isn't all European. They have a whole Africa book. It's, like, that respectful and was written by people who knew what they were talking about and they did the proper research for. And would that hurt Wizards? Probably not. I mean, that weirdly, that's Paizo's origin. Paizo released good, like when they left, I believe one of their co-creators was at Wizards. They left Wizards and started making good projects for 3.5. And when 3.5 went belly up with 4, they just turned themselves into 3.7. So this is kind of a reversion to form. The other thing that we're seeing Wizards do, though, is it's buying up some of the independent roleplay platforms. Forget, we just bought a big one because they already have D&D Beyond, but now they're buying, and they're not changing them, they're just buying them. So we are in a position where they're going to have a lot of platform control. One of the reasons why I think they're so generous with open license is so they don't get hit with monopoly lawsuits. I'm actually somewhat serious about that. So because they own so much of the share of the market now. What does this mean? Well, it means that role-playing, for whatever reason, and I do think the social interaction, and they finally found a way to do it online without it becoming a massive online multiplayer game, because those don't play the same. Is leading to a renaissance that I don't see stopping, because what I was saying earlier, even when Wizards releases a bad book, and last year they released a book that's pretty universally seen as bad, the Strixhaven book.
They make money.
It still sold gangbusters because they don't release more than like 6 things a year.
They don't overshadow their releases by hammering release after release. They make it so that people can wait a little bit, save up their money, and buy the next book. It's easy to keep up with their product productions. Like if you followed Wizards of the Coast, right, on a middle class job, right, it is plausible that you can just buy every single product that they produce for $5.
You would spend like $200 a year. And the other thing that they do is, unlike other products, they allow deep discounts. Like, so you can, and not that I love this, but it's not hurting the other products either. And one thing I've been thinking about is like these supplement books, that one of the advantages Wizards has, because it produces in bulk, is that it's internal competitors, people who make stuff that uses their rule system, but with the exception of Cobalt, have to be pretty expensive. Like, you want to do a Kickstarter, nice monster book for D&D. It's not going to hurt Wizards, and your book might be nicer and more coherent than anything Wizards puts out. In fact, I will say most of the best monster books for 5th edition are not made by Wizards of the Coast. But your basic book, it's $40 retail, or $50 retail, but you can get it on discount or whatever for about between $25 and $35, depending on when you're buying it after it comes out. Like, you can't do that with these other books. They're not made at scale. There's not enough of them made for them to do that. The creators, and people buy them, don't get me wrong, but Wizards maintains like the default settings too, because they can offer them so much cheaper than the people producing it. The only company that could produce that scale, that could offer them at a similar price point in the Wizards, is Paizo, because Paizo will do something that Wizards doesn't do and release small softcover books for like $25.
Well, Varn, we are pushing up against the hour. So we will have to leave this conversation for another time. But I'm excited about seeing Spelljammer. I'm excited about seeing, not really excited about seeing Dragonlance. I think it's a bit boring, but Spelljammer's cool. I definitely want to see those hippo people back, the GIF. And
I'm super excited about Spelljammer too. I'm interested if they're going to try to make Dragonlance different, because like I said, Hickman and Vise aren't involved in this, so they can do what they want. And they're including this massive battle game in it, which I'm like, are they? I mean, it just seems ironic that they may be turning Dragonlance into their war game, which is wild.
Which would be interesting. Well, everybody, this is Gaming Materialists for another month. We'll see you back next month.
Probably with a guest.
Probably with a guest. Yeah, we had a good guest last time. Our best episode in terms of numbers by a long way. So hopefully we'll get another exciting guest. And as we say on This Is Revolution, we are